So, I recently watched a show called Cross On Rondo of the Angel and Dragon, and oh boy, have I not seen crap like that in a very, very long time. It filled me to the brim with such simmering anger at the show's wasted potential that I'm pretty sure I recreated World War II in my watery dimension. After that tragedy faded, the thought of another show and the subsequent nuclear fallout that was my thinking process popped up. That show was RWBY. At first glance, both of these shows may seem uncomparable, up to the point of it being like comparing Steven Universe to Mobile Suit Gundam. They're both action and adventure shows, but that's about it. But once you look inside, both shows actually do share a few similarities with each other. A world that combines sci-fi with fantasy, a godly villain with people who follow their orders, girls fighting monsters, themes of oppression and distrust towards groups that are seen as non-human, a magic-esque power that basically runs the world as is, a big conspiracy as to why everything is as it is, the main character being something that can undo the big bad's work, etc, etc. So, why do I bring this up? Well, as many of you know, RWBY is seen as a show that knows what it wants to be, but not really know how to go about it. With many episodes just having characters talk and do nothing, seemingly making the fandom's ships come true, and stuff is sometimes introduced and never fully explored. With that in mind, imagine Cross-Ange as being the anti-RWBY.
In the worst possible way.
And so, I am here today to tell you guys that while RWBY may not be perfect, it could have been a whole lot worse. What? You thought the title was going to be me talking about a show that's far better than RWBY? Pfft, don't judge a fish by its scales. Now, let's begin this wretched tromp through fan service swamps and missed potential forests. This is why Cross-Ange is everything RWBY isn't. Where RWBY knows what it wants to be, Cross-Ange does not. It wants to be
Dark and dramatic.
an episodic slice of life, a comedy romance, a conspiracy about the way things are, a tale of hardship, a riches to rags story, the tale of oppression, and you can already tell why this is a problem. All of these are in the foreground, and most of what I just listed do not meld well with each other. The first few episodes have people stripped of their human rights, sodomized, beaten, raped, and held responsible for the deaths of their teammates. The episodes after that are about the misadventures on this prison island, meeting new people, dealing with bullies, and attending an annual fiesta. Clearly that doesn't clash tonally at all. At least with RWBY, the first volumes were a slice of life adventure. Volumes 4 and onward were more about the characters' personal struggles and their new mission to save the world, and all of them have a general flowing narrative along with them. The point is, all those volumes were clearly something that could meld together. And at least after the fall of Beacon, it doesn't just go back to the formula volumes 1 and 2 had. It'd be pretty weird to see what remains of Team Juniper and RWBY going on some wacky adventure and completely ignore the loss of loved ones, the trauma they've gained, and that all the kingdoms may be on the verge of war with each other.
I would love this world without you in it if I didn't have you.
When the characters in RWBY sit down to talk, that is mostly because it gives the audience a break from the action. In theory. Most of the time, all it does is progress the plot in a tell-don't-show format, which, in a visual medium, is the last thing you want to do. But at least it progresses the story. Cross-Ange has a lot of action scenes, scenes of violence ranging from deaths and torture, and I'll get to that next. But the point is, they are usually pointless filler that either add nothing to the plot or are just there for eye candy. It gets so bad that any scene that's an important plot point can't have the proper time dedicated to it because in this limited series, they decided shock, sex, and spectacle is far more important. I don't know about you, but I'd rather take characters talking that continues the plot over scenes that have no reason to exist outside of just being eye-pleasing or just for pure shock.
See you driving round town with the girl I love, and I'm like,
So, one of RWBY's biggest complaints is that it seems to give in to fan shipping, Blake and Yang being the most prominent. I disagree. The team dynamic of RWBY since its inception is that of a sisterly bond, similar to how the Turtles are portrayed as brothers. Sure, Yang flirts with Blake and they hold hands, but that's more akin to sisters being there for each other. Heck, by that logic, you can also say that parents who kiss their children and hold their hands are also romantically involved. That does not mean they are, nor does it mean the same for Yang and Blake. It's mostly the fans being the fans. But if you really want something that's giving into fan service, then look no further than Cross Ange, which either has a character stripping down / being stripped down to their birthday suits, nearly every character wanting to do the bed bounce tango every other episode for no other reason, and even the main character, after having reunited with the one she loved after believing him dead, decides the best thing to prove he is real is to bang each other right then and there. Heck, the poor girl can't even keep her clothes on in the freaking intro, and there's an episode literally called Bikini Escape. At least with RWBY, you don't have Yang and Blake going hot and hearty with each other, while Ruby and White strip down to their skivvies. Cross Ange never really feels like it discusses any of its themes outside of the conspiracy in that the Normas, the non-human race, are seen as dirt, and mostly uses its themes to justify adding shock value, and feels like it usually glosses over its lore or throws new stuff in out of the blue. The best example is that there is a race of dragon people that are evolved from humans. I kid you not, none of this was truly hinted at until the 11th episode. There was no build-up, no hints, no nothing to suggest this. Nothing. It was like, oh, that's a thing. Deal with it! I know RWBY does the same thing, but at least it doesn't seem too out of nowhere and doesn't conflict with pre-established lore. For example, the artifact they carry is a lamp. The RWBY show is based on the idea of fairy tale characters, but if they were badasses. Of course there'd be something to do with a genie in it. I know RWBY isn't known for stellar writing, but neither is Cross Ange. But what RWBY has over Cross Ange is that the writing at least feels like it flows naturally. Like, this is how and where the character would go. Whereas Cross Ange mostly feels like these characters go wherever the writer needs them to go. For example, with the side characters, it's very clear that's the case, as we have assholes with no backstory suddenly become these tragic characters and best friends with the main character, and loving family members suddenly become bad guys with no hints or build-up on the flip of a dime. But the worst case of the show's writing is most definitely the main character herself, Angelis. Yes, I bothered to learn her name for this part specifically, and no, I will not call her Ange because that's a stupid name. I know the characters of RWBY aren't the most amazing, but the arcs end as you'd expect. Weiss, for example. She goes from a stuck-up prima donna loyal to her toxic father's expectations to a disillusioned child stripped of her birthright to an independent warrior who leads to the downfall of the man that pretty much ruined her family name. With Angelis, her story ends so drastically different from how it started, the show should have just been episodic and not narrative because of it. Her story is a privileged princess stripped of her rights and being forced to live at the bottom of society. As time goes by, she sees how vile the world is for the first time and decides to fight back against it. Okay, that's easy. After hearing that, you should know the journey and how it ends. She rallies everyone up behind her, they lead a war against their oppressors, and Ange retakes the throne and decides to rule alongside her new friends to usher in a new era of peace and equality, having grown wiser and more humble through it all. But no, she does not form the rebellion. She inherits it from a person who practically does nothing but beat her at any given chance, and aside from a handshake and stating that she wants to start that new empire I mentioned, she instead opens up a cafe. Because freedom? Girl power? The latter might be possible because one of the last things she tells the villain before he dies is that he doesn't know how to treat a woman and all he wants to do is get his freak on with her. I'm sorry, but that's like having Moses, instead of leading his people after his time in exile, doing God's wonders, defeating Egypt and saving his people, instead pushes the responsibilities of leadership onto someone else. Just like how that wouldn't fit the story of Moses, the story of Angelis doesn't fit either. The end of a character's arc should be a mirror opposite of how they began, different with many similarities. Another problem is, as you might have guessed by now, it tries to fit this Lord of the Rings sized amount of lore about two Earths with their own histories and cultures, 3 races, a great world war, an Armageddon, the creation of a new world, gods, and the end of the freaking world, alongside other things I may have missed, into 25 episodes. I could make a whole nother video talking about how the story doesn't work, but I'll make it short and say it is bloated, like a dead whale. And the most painful part is, despite the bloated lore and the less than stellar writing, the show's ending fits really well. We started off with this false utopia where peace and understanding thrive, but it only applies with certain people and the rest are made into slaves to do their dirty work. But when it ends, this new empire starts to form, and while we never see it finished, it truly does look and feel like that utopia the old one was supposed to be. It's clear they had an idea for the show, but because of crunch time and the priorities they set, it just couldn't become something that's decent. I know it sounds like I've mostly been doing this to justify my hatred towards Cross-Ange, and while I do enjoy RWBY, I also acknowledge it isn't the best it can be right now. What it is that Cross-Ange made me realize that while RWBY isn't the best, I am glad that it is as good as it is right now, because it could have been a whole lot worse, and at least it still has a chance to get better, which it has been taking advantage of with the manga and Volume 7 being widely seen as huge improvements. But it seems like a lot of people disagree, as a lot more people will defend Cross-Ange in a way that you'll never see be used to defend RWBY. They say it's deep, allegorical, and a meaningful critique on human society, completely ignoring that it's obviously just trying to be an edgier version of Gundam, except the edge is so sharp it cuts off its own hands. So my final question and thought ultimately is, though both shows have the same problems, one has them worse, and yet why is it the worst show out of the two is commonly declared underrated, and yet RWBY isn't? Okay, I'd be lying if I said I didn't like a few things about Cross-Ange. Some of the non-erotic visuals look nice at times, some of the soundtracks sound good, a few meme-worthy faces, and the Mothra roar. Aside from that, the rest of the show was more akin to a massive train wreck. It's awful and truly horrible, but you just can't look away no matter how much you want to.